Då är ni välkomna till det här, och kan det vara fjärde frukostsamtalet med Svenska teknik- och designföretagen. Jag heter Magnus Höj och är VD på det här branschkansliet som då har arkitektföretag och ingenjörsföretag som medlemmar. Och idag har vi glädjen att välkomna Kieran Long som är inte ny, men ganska ny, ett år gammalt sen som överintendent på ArkDes. To start with, I will have this interview in English since Kieran is from the UK. What's your background?
Well, I come from a background in writing and in journalism originally. I spent nearly 20 years editing magazines, making television programs, writing, all of that kind of thing around architecture and design. I started in architecture and then gradually got broader. And then made a big switch in 2012 working on the Venice Biennale with David Chipperfield, where I was heading his curatorial team into the world of, warm bodies in the room, I like to say. Curating is kind of a wonderful thing because you actually get to meet the people you're making stuff for. So in 2012 I did a big project there in Venice and joined the Victoria and Albert Museum after that. So since then I've been very committed to museums and to institutions. I took on this job a year ago and still really excited by the possibilities.
We'll get back to that, but first a few yes or no questions to get things started. If you were to choose, Paris or Rome?
Paris.
Paris, okay. Yes or no to the new Nobel Center?
Yes.
Obviously. Le Corbusier or Gaudi?
Le Corbusier.
Okay. Some others, champagne or dry martini?
That's a no-win situation for me.
You'll have both.
I'll have both. Yeah, one after the other. Depends on the order.
Window or aisle on the plane?
Window.
Window. Monday morning or Friday morning?
Friday morning.
Friday morning. And what would you prefer, Facebook feed or the printed Sunday edition of The Guardian?
I mean, if you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said Facebook, but still now the printed edition. I think.
We'll go for the printed version. Okay, perfect. So you've been heading ArkDes for a year now. What's your first impressions?
I mean, there are lots of first impressions. I mean, I must say that just as a place to work, there are more cultural differences between Sweden and the UK than I could have imagined. And I only really realized those a year on, as you try to really wrestle with the dynamics of a Swedish workplace and so on. But I mean, my first impression of architecture and design here is as it was before, and I knew Sweden rather well. It's extraordinarily...
Since you're married to...
I'm married to a Swede, yeah, and I've been coming here for many years. And of course I've written about architecture and design all over Europe and the world. And I still feel like Sweden is an extraordinary design culture, a place where a belief in design as a problem-solving discipline is still alive and well. That sounds obvious here perhaps, but it's not so obvious if you come from a place like London where there's lots of motivations for people getting into design. I still feel here there's a kind of idealism about what design and architecture can do. And so that's been really fun to engage with. But it's of course a very different culture, a very different place from London. I sort of feel being a myndighetschef, like I do feel the kind of heavy hand of the top-down Swedish state a bit more than one feels in the UK, of course. So.
Would that more of a positive feeling or a negative?
Both, I think. I mean, it's extraordinarily positive that we still have large-scale public investment in so many things that in the UK has gone away. And for architecture and design, I mean, just in this city, in Stockholm, you have hundreds of urban designers and architects sat in City Hall doing work, and in London, in the GLA, in the Greater London Assembly, that's not the case, and we suffer for it. Having said that, I think there are some things that Sweden can also learn from a culture where many of the most interesting projects, particularly in the public realm, happen from the bottom up, and they happen generated by different kinds of organizations and not necessarily the state dictating terms.
So you would hope to see more of an underground people coming from the bottom up rather than from top down?
Yeah, I mean, it's never that black and white, is it? But I do think what we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years in London is a revolution in how we treat public spaces in the city and how they're designed and how they're made for people. And I think people have been the citizens have been given a greater stake in those processes. And here, of course, we have an extraordinarily transparent and democratic culture, but I don't always feel that we're innovating in the way that we work with citizens here in the public realm, and that's something that I hope ArkDes can be a laboratory of, new ways of approaching those questions as Swedish cities change.
Would that impression also go for the discussion around architecture in Sweden? Would the state of that be the same as looking from more of a top-down perspective? What would you say about the discussion around architecture at the moment in Sweden?
I mean, at the moment, it's extraordinarily exciting. Excuse me. We've just had the new politics, the new proposition for architecture, form and design, which by world standards is a visionary document. I know we can all wish more for these kinds of things always, and any government activity is a compromise.
Sure.
But coming from the UK, to have 3 departments saying this is what we want to do, we want to put architecture and design at the top of the agenda. I mean, you can't ask for a better base for the profession and for us as an institution to go out and really talk about what design can do in the public realm. Whether at the other end of the scale, whether there's always whether architecture really, well, maybe the necessity for that politics is because architecture and design are not always top of the list when it comes to large-scale urban change. That's the same in every country, but I think we have, if we're talking about the state of the discourse just right now, I think we have a unique opportunity in a European scale to really lead in what it means to bring architecture into the centre of the public discourse.
What would you say that your and ArkDes role would be in that discussion going forward?
We're finding our role, and we've started to do a few experiments that I start to shape for me what I think ArkDes can do. Of course, we'll always be a vibrant public platform for the general public to come and experience extraordinary works of architecture and design. But I also think we can be a place, perhaps a necessary place, for speculation about the future city. What kind of places do we want to live in? If you didn't have to have a client, if you hadn't signed that contract, if you didn't have that deadline, how would you think through a problem differently? And just to give one example, 2 weeks ago we got quite a lot of press for a project we're doing about infartshinder, about terrorist defences in Stockholm. Right. It's a very small example of how I think we can work. We invited 3 designers, very different kinds of designers, to speculate on a real problem. We build those things in one-to-one, we're going to show them in an exhibition, and they've started a public debate about what should this infrastructure be if we have to build these defences, if the city is vulnerable in that way. What can design bring to that discussion? And I'm kind of quite proud of us just injecting a little bit of a different perspective on that through speculation, but speculation grounded in a real problem.
One of the things I noticed when you entered this, started this work, was you talking about having a more European discussion around what architecture can give, maybe, or the discussion in general. Do you think that we are getting more of that? Are we seeing more European discussion, or is it still very national-based?
I mean, I find the situation much more nationally sort of based here than certainly in the UK. I mean, London is a global city, and the language is obviously more of a global language. Absolutely, and there are ups and downs with that. I mean, there are particular conditions here in Sweden that we have to face, but the really big challenges, climate change, of demographic change, of the way our cities are growing, of high land values, all of those things are common to many, many European cities and many European countries, and we must learn from the best. I do think that architecture and design culture here could benefit from a few more international perspectives, and I would say that the system here doesn't make it easy for international architects in particular to come and work.
What do you think about that? When you say that, what do you mean then?
I mean, I'm just thinking of some experience, friends and colleagues who are working here on major projects, the project management culture here, the way that architects are not at the head of the contract, the way that, sometimes it can feel, I think, to outside architects that architecture is just one of many services, that the form and shape and public intent of the building is just one thing alongside traffic planning and sustainability and everything else, rather than the most important thing. And, I'm not here to do public relations for architects, but there's only one profession that has the responsibility of making a better city for all, in a holistic way, and that for me is still architecture. The traffic planners are not involved in that, engineers are not really, they don't have that responsibility exactly. It's architects who have to imagine the future city. That doesn't mean they should always have all the power, it doesn't mean I believe that they're always good at that, but still we have to believe that there's a profession that can take hold of the city and say, what is this place? What is this place as a public sort of creation, as a common artwork, as a thing that we make together, as a place that has to be a setting for the future of democracy as well as its past. And I'm not sure that there's, I think architecture is still the best profession to hold that responsibility, and therefore they should be taken more seriously.
And this fact that you're explaining now, where we have a different way of working in Sweden, that makes it more difficult to have a common discussion with colleagues in, say, Spain or France. Would that be one of the obstacles that you see?
I feel a little bit sometimes that there's a reaction here when I sort of, I have friends and colleagues here who work here as architects from overseas, and when I say, well, it's interesting, this such and such a person put this problem to me. In Sweden I get this reaction, well, that's just kind of the system here. They have to understand this is how it works here. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that we've seen in London, for instance, is major projects have changed the parameters and have helped to further a public discussion about what we want the city to be like. And just to give one example, and I think we're looking, just to take for instance, right now Boverket is searching for a Riksarchitect. We're looking for leaders, professional leaders who are going to tell us and set the agenda about what future Swedish cities can be. Well, we had a person like that in England, and that was Richard Rogers in the late 90s. He was obviously a British person, but half Italian and very much not part of the British establishment then, in his earlier life. He grew to be part of the British establishment, but he led an extraordinary change in the way that British planners, British design businesses, British businesses, and we all think about the future of British cities. Now, that was 20 years ago, but it really made a tangible change because Richard was the kind of individual who could lead that conversation, who could say simple things well, who could have lunch with Tony Blair, but could also make a piece of planning policy. Those are extraordinary skills, but we need those leaders, and sometimes they come from overseas. I mean, wouldn't it be interesting if the Riksarchitect was not a Swede? Could you even imagine that?
I can, but I'm not sure who that would be, but I think that's a good idea. So you have big hopes for this new individual or
we have to.
function.
I mean, what a fantastic gesture to say we're going to have somebody who's a public intellectual who leads the debate about architecture in the public realm. I mean, that's great. We need that. Of course we need that. We need
so
more
you need
than
sort of an ambassador,
Yeah.
more than maybe than someone that is making plans, and maybe someone that is...
Of course. Somebody can't sit in the centre and draw all the plans. They need to be the person going to see the Prime Minister and say, and having that access and saying, look, we need to make bigger strategic changes. Of course, they're not going to be designing every part of every city in Sweden.
No. Is it good that that person will be located in Malmö?
Yeah, I mean, I'm neutral about that. I'm not Stockholm-centric in my thinking. I think I'm sure that person will be travelling a lot.
But you would hope for more, not only a European discussion around architecture, but also maybe would you like to see more of European ways of working here?
Yeah, I mean, why don't I talk from the perspective of a museum director and director of an institution. I think what you see in great European architectural cultures and design cultures are strong institutions. And there's a feedback between the professions and the institutions in a positive way. And maybe, in ArkDes' case, that hasn't been the case for the last few years. We are now open for that dialogue. That's precisely what we want to create. And if you think of the role that the Flanders Architecture Institute has played in Belgium, or the Architecture Foundation played in 90s and 2000s London, or the institutions that are helping to shape the agenda are also giving a platform to the profession as a place to think out loud and to communicate their message. That's exactly where I want ArkDes to be. But that goes two ways. We can create the conditions, but the professions also have to play their part, be positive about that platform, participate, turn up, show their work in the spirit of openness. And I think that's a relationship I see in Switzerland, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in the UK, in places where we've had really positive architectural and design cultures. So, and I'm not saying that there's much wrong with Stockholm in one way, in Sweden in one way, but I think the institutions have been lacking a bit. My institution has been lacking a bit, and we're now fully open for business, ready to be that platform and explore those ideas together with the professions.
I'd like to come back later to the market development, but one thing that maybe could be an argument against your perspective would be the technology development, the way the construction industry is changing based on digitalization or robots and all that ways of working, where also the role of the architect would be different. Do you see that that is, I guess from my perspective, I see that we have in some ways been more exploring this way of working maybe more than they have in other parts of Europe.
Absolutely.
Where this would sort of more lead the way rather than we are heading on the wrong direction.
Absolutely, and I wouldn't want to say that. I mean, Sweden by no standards is heading in the wrong direction. I mean, the standards here are extraordinarily high in all sorts of fields of architecture and design. I mean, when it comes to new technologies, that changes the game for every profession, not just architecture. And I think all the professions need to be more open for dialogue with new fields of design that are emerging out of new technologies. At the Victoria and Albert Museum, I worked for many years on an exhibition about the future of design in a very broad way, and we will bring that show to Stockholm in the beginning of 2019. And that's a show that embraces everything from DNA engineering to AI to changes in the political landscape to environmental engineering, the biggest possible technologies that are changing the most, the kind of foundations of how we work and how we live. We see all those things in that project, and I see those things as cutting two ways. All of those technologies at once can be frightening and scary and change things in ways that we can't yet predict the conclusion of. But they also offer an extraordinary democratization of tools. We have objects in that show, which you'll see here in our exhibition next year. For instance, the first satellite that costs 10,000 euros to send to space. Now, if a satellite costs 10,000 euros, it means that any university can now send their own satellite to space. And this is a revolution in how we collect data, how we learn, the democratization of these technologies is going to be a massive positive. It's no longer all going to be held by Google and Facebook and companies and of that scale and by governments. So while some of those changes will be challenging and difficult, I think for every professional they provide extraordinary possibilities if they're open to working with those people.
Let's get back to that question later. I have many questions left here. Let's go to the question of urbanization, and you. I guess this is one of the areas that you mentioned that the growing cities is that. And that has presented a lot of new questions for us as societies. Is there more to be done here to understand the way that the cities are working and how they are developing? And what do you see ArkDes' role in that discussion?
You mean in the context of kind of rural to urban migration or the growth of cities in general?
Could be, yeah.
I mean, it's a very big question.
Sure. Let's have a short answer.
A short answer, I mean... Okay, my perspective on this is that the main tool we have to build new cities is housing. That's what we're building cities of, and it is not that easy to make good cities out of housing. We must learn to do that. We must learn what kind of public spaces can you make with housing. That sounds like a paradox, but I think it's a very interesting problem and one we have to face here.
And you would, I'd like you to do more of that discussion at ArkDes.
And that's exactly what we're planning to do. So the question of the question of how you make a good city with housing is not going to be solved by individual architects getting individual projects in the suburbs of Stockholm or in any other Swedish city. We're going to have to make a space, and we are making a space for having a different kind of train of thought. We have space for research, we have space for smaller exhibitions. Now we're creating those platforms for all of your members and for architects and designers across the spectrum to come and speculate with us about those new solutions. And because we're a national institution, we have access to politicians and we have access to the audiences who might need to hear that.
One of the perspectives of the urbanization is obviously that we've been building a lot during the last years. It's been so much to do for our companies and the construction industry also. What kind of challenges would you say that presents to us? I mean, we haven't really been able to develop a policy and maybe planning in the way that we should have, given the state that we're in.
It's very interesting. I mean, there are no unemployed architects here. It's really a strange situation. And, of course, because they're all busy and making money and doing stuff for fees, it's going to be hard to say, we're going to stop and do a piece of research. But you do see practices in Sweden doing that. And I think one of the things we hope to provide is a platform for practices who are making independent research, who are pursuing kind of research and sort of design directions not necessarily in their built projects, but in their work in general. We want to give a megaphone to that kind of work and say, well, how are you imagining things otherwise? And I think that feels like it's been a bit missing here. Where is that platform? Where's the platform for a practice who's developed a whole piece of thinking about master planning that doesn't have an application right now? Where do they show it? And ArkDes should be that place.
Have we been building too much too quickly?
I mean, we need the housing, so too much too quickly is we can say that as much as we like, but it's going to be built. And I must say, from a British perspective, I'm impressed by the levels of delivery in the Swedish system.
The quality of what we're building is okay, from your perspective?
It's very hard to generalize about that. But I think I come from a country where for 10 years we've been saying we need to build more, and nothing has been built. So the fact that stuff's happening here, we shouldn't dismiss that. We shouldn't be saying, oh, it's not good enough, we should somehow stop. The housing is needed. But I mean, we need to use those forces and use that momentum and create create exemplars. I think that's what the Architecture, Form and Design Bill asks us to do, and many other authorities to do. Where do we find the really great examples that can help to change by example?
Would you be open to, or what do you think about the idea of building a totally new city in Sweden? That's been a discussion that some politicians have presented.
Yeah, new. I mean, I suppose you have a lot of land in Sweden compared to what I'm used to. I don't think anything's really ever new, is it? Nothing's ever a blank canvas. Even if whichever site you chose for that city would still be working with the context. And the projects I get most excited about right now in Sweden are the ones who are really trying to understand the context, whether it's farmland or whether it's a complex, edge of city condition. That's the place we must start. But yeah, I mean, we're going to have to build at the scale of new towns. So yeah, I mean, some of that thinking is relevant. And I would say some of the learning we could do from the last time Sweden built large-scale communities outside cities, there's positive lessons there as well as negative ones.
Absolutely. Coming from another perspective and the UK, it must be obvious to you that we have rather big architecture companies in Sweden, and they're well known, White, Tengbom, Sweco, just to name a few. What do you think? What's your perspective on that development? Is that a trend going forward that you would see in other countries? Normally, I mean, architecture firms is rather small. It's one or two, or much smaller at least than compared to Sweden. Is that an asset to Sweden that we can build on?
Those individual companies are certainly big assets to Sweden. I mean, they have their powerhouses for the profession, and we, in White's case, for instance, some of the work that's going on there is extraordinary, and they do, as I think architects should, they do try to take a leading position in a more general discourse about cities. So I think that's an asset. I think we should be braver in Sweden about giving jobs to smaller practices, though. I think any vibrant architecture culture needs to create a production line of those practices further down the chain in order that we get those bigger businesses in the future. And just to give one example, which I'm talking about quite a lot at the moment, in the UK, the Greater London Assembly, some years ago now, started a series of projects just designing small parks and squares and public space projects, and gave a lot of those projects to small and emerging practices. And what they created in that is a production line of professionals who know about working in the public realm, who understand the dynamics of the public realm. And they're all 10 years older now, and they're running 30, 40 strong practices, and they're so valuable to the city. And we mustn't neglect that. So I think there's an opportunity to give younger and smaller practices smaller projects. But the bigger, when I look at the quality of work and research that's coming out of some of those bigger practices, we must also use that. And I hope that we will come into a mutually supportive situation. I mean, ArkDes needs those practices, there's no doubt.
Absolutely. Another trend that is obvious from my perspective is that, and also a bet for my association, is where engineers and architects are meeting, and we will see that trend has been obvious. We see a lot of engineering companies buying architecture practices. What's your take on that trend? Is that something that you will see more of?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's happening in the UK. It's happening in lots of countries, and I see it as a big positive. I think the multidisciplinary big businesses now know that design needs to be at the heart of their thinking in many, many ways. And so it can only be positive that they bring in new perspectives on that. And I'm sure it's not just architects they need, it's coders and 3D printing experts, and it's video game designers, and it's a whole range of different design fields that I'm sure those multidisciplinaries will embrace. For me, it doesn't change this feeling I have, a rather idealistic feeling perhaps, that architecture still represents a really important distinctive professional set of concerns, which is slightly more general and broader than most of the individual disciplines that are in one of those companies. Architecture embraces the whole city and the whole sense of citizenship and its physical setting. And I hope that those multidisciplinaries will also embrace that kind of feeling, because that's both exciting but also necessary as we build at the scale we're building.
And do you think that the architect, the individual, is more important than the network of people that is making out of that would be a company, or would you sort of root for the architect as an individual?
I don't know if I root for them so much as think, the way I think about it sometimes is that, doctors, their first responsibility is not to kill their patient. And architects' first responsibility is not to ruin the city. Like, it's a similar kind of responsibility. You have, as an architect, a responsibility beyond your client and beyond your contract, to the city in general, to an idea of the city. And I still, I find that a kind of exciting and necessary role, professional role. It's the nature of being a professional.
Because one of the trends I would see would be more of the teamwork that you're doing, being in the construction industry, but also in these engineering and architecture companies that I'm representing, and seeing, maybe this is my bias, but I think that that teamwork is maybe becoming more and more important compared to what the individual is doing.
Absolutely, and I don't think, when I talk about these things, I'm not talking about individual authorship. I'm not talking about who should own the pen. I'm just talking about what is the conversation about. Sure. In the world of building information modeling and of large-scale team working coordinated by technical systems, we need space to step out of that and say, what are these places for? What kind of city are we creating here? And I think it's not the architect as an individual, it's the idea of architecture, it's the profession of architecture that still holds the longest history of that discussion in our culture, and I think that's necessary. Maybe I would say that as a museum director, we hold that history too, in physical form, but that's an important history.
Do you think that we will see more engineering in the context of ArkDes going forward?
I mean, I would like to see, one thing I think that's really important about ArkDes in the future is that we should be, what I say, like a Kunsthal for future technologies, for fields of design that do not yet have a home, So I would love to work with, and I did work at the V&A on a large-scale engineering season. We did a big exhibition about Övarup, but then in the garden we made this extraordinary structure using advanced composites, super lightweight structures spanning the garden in collaboration with a university in Germany. It was both technology and engineering, but also it was a setting for events, it was a setting for public life, and for me that's the ideal kind of project. What I always say about ArkDes is we're not interested in individual professions. We're interested in how design and architecture meets the citizen, and that's sometimes engineers, and sometimes it's video game designers, and sometimes it's architects, and sometimes it's designers, and we are Catholic in our tastes.
Perfect. Last question. What is the next step for ArkDes? You mentioned a few things, but what will be your top priorities going for for the coming year or so?
Well, I can tell you about our priorities for the coming month. Perfect. It's an extraordinarily exciting month coming up. This month, just at the end of May, we open a major project at the Venice Biennale. The first time ArkDes or any institution like ours has been invited into the main exhibition of the Biennale, so see that in Venice. Then on June the 1st, we open Public Luxury, my first big exhibition, which is a big, broad exhibition about the relationship of design to the public realm. And then on June the 19th, we open a new gallery building at ArkDes by a hot young architect called Deline Brackgård, which will be a space for these speculative projects that I was talking about, and a big summer party, so all come, and then we're going on holiday and having a rest.
Perfect. Thank you very much for coming here, and good luck in the future.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Bye.